Hello, my name is David Van Cleek. I'm a professor in the practice in the Center for Engineering Leadership at Rice University. Here on campus, I teach two courses, an undergraduate course for freshmen and sophomores, and a higher level course for seniors and graduate students. But a little bit about myself first. I too am an engineer. I did my undergraduate studies at Princeton University and graduated with a bachelor's degree in chemical engineering in 1973. While I was at Princeton, I was enrolled in ROTC and was commissioned as a second lieutenant when I graduated. After graduation, I was stationed by the Army in Italy and Germany for 4 years before I decided to return to graduate school here at Rice University. And I finished my PhD here in 1981. Following my studies here at Rice, I joined Shell Oil Company as a research engineer and spent over 34 years doing individual research and as a manager in their organization. During my last 15 years at Shell, I also was a campus recruiter. So I had many opportunities to be on campus, to interview students, looking for those skills that I thought would help those candidates fit best into Shell's organization. I was specifically interested in their leadership abilities. I also draw in my leadership philosophy from my experience as a Boy Scout adult leader. So you will see throughout the specialization that I will use concepts from military, industry, and my Boy Scout experience to present to you those skills that I think will be most valuable for you as an engineering leader. As I close, I'd like to leave you with this thought, and it comes from my LinkedIn profile. I help engineers learn leadership skills so they can leverage their creative and technical skills to make a better world for all of us. My passion is teaching, and my joy is seeing others use what I show them. Welcome to the Relationship Management course in the Engineering Leadership Specialization. If you haven't already done so, I'd strongly suggest that you take the Self-Awareness course first, as we will be building on the foundation that we laid in that course. In this course, we're going to talk about the soft skills, those things that I consider to be the hardest part of being an effective leader. This course consists of 4 modules: communications, building power and influence, managing conflict, and conducting effective meetings. We'll also introduce your writing assignment in this course, which will be to conduct the engineer interview. In the self-awareness course, I modeled this interview by talking to 2 of my colleagues to show how to conduct that interview and to model the questions that you'll be asking. There'll also be a quiz as part of each of the modules in this course. And lastly, we'll continue the journaling practice that we used in the self-awareness course to help you capture your reflections and insights about leadership. We'll begin with the communications course. Here we're going to cover the topics mostly related to interpersonal verbal interactions. What we won't talk about here are the presentations and the writing skills that you'll develop more thoroughly in the communications specialization. So let's begin by introducing my leadership observation topic for this module. Bad leaders get people hurt, whether it's physically, emotionally, or spiritually. We'll come back to that observation at the end of the module. The objectives for this module will be largely related to how you give and receive feedback. This will be a practice that you will use every day. It'll become routine in how you go about improving the performance of those who follow you. You'll be doing that in one of 2 forms, either coaching or counseling, and understanding the difference between those two and the appropriate tools to use in each one will largely determine how effective you are in improving the performance of those who follow you. Active listening is one of those critical leadership skills that will enable you to reduce the barriers to communication that you may encounter when you don't communicate very effectively. So understanding those inhibitors and barriers, ways of overcoming them, and preventing them in the first place will largely determine your effectiveness in communicating with those you lead. Let's begin our discussion of communications by focusing on feedback and its importance in the process of developing and coaching your followers. First, it's one of the most important pathways to that performance improvement. If your followers are not getting feedback, they won't know what things to work on. They'll have difficulty setting and achieving goals, and you won't have very effective ways of measuring performance. If you're not encouraging your followers to grow, not only will they not improve, but you won't be developing the future leaders that will be following you. One of the most fundamental aspects of effective communications is to build trust. If you don't build trust and build that relationship, then you're going to have difficulty in improving not only your performance, but that of your followers. As a result, we tend to avoid doing this. This is difficult stuff. So it's not uncommon that many leaders will avoid the necessity of providing constructive feedback. So in that regard, my colleagues are fond of saying that the soft stuff is really the hard stuff. You don't get better at doing feedback or providing feedback unless you do it frequently and get used to doing it. If you avoid it, then it will remain hard to do. This is critical to your success. Let's continue with our discussion of what is the difference between coaching and counseling. These are the two forums where you'll be providing feedback to your followers. Recognizing when to use the techniques in each of these areas will be very important to preventing barriers and inhibitors to providing that effective feedback. So let's begin with talking about what is coaching. Well, coaching is giving advice. This is really performance feedback, skills related. How does somebody actually do the job? Whereas counseling is going to be more directed at behavior kinds of issues, helping someone understand and resolve problems that you see that are preventing better performance. Coaching might be characterized, I can help you do something better, whereas counseling might be, I can help you understand that there's a problem that exists, and that problem may be rooted in behavior. So coaching is used when there are lack of skills and you need to be directive in nature. They don't have the information they need. Their skill level isn't what it needs to be, and they need to be given specific tasks to do in the right order so that they improve. It also is used when the follower needs to have specific directive guidance so that they fully understand the problem. Counseling, on the other hand, is going to be used when there are issues related to attitudes, personality, other things that might affect their ability to perform that aren't skills-based. So let's take some examples here and see where they might be either coaching or counseling. Our first example is a young engineer leading a project for the first time. Well, in this case, that young engineer probably doesn't have all the skills that he needs to be completely effective. So this more likely represents a coaching opportunity. Well, how about a member of a project who criticizes others with very personal criticisms? This sounds to me more like a behavior issue and probably is a counseling issue. What about someone on a project that routinely scans Facebook or is diverted some other way when they ought to be paying attention? Well, again, this begins to sound like a behavior issue rather than a skills or performance related one. So this is probably a counseling opportunity. What about a first-time leader who consistently communicates with their teammates over the weekend? This one's tough. This is one that, depending on the corporate culture, may be acceptable. So as you look at this, you're really going to have to assess the context, the corporate culture that you're in, and what are the norms for within your team. Is this acceptable or not? This is one that I think could be either, depending on that context. Ordinarily, where work-life balance is an issue, this might fall more closely to a counseling issue. These then distinguish coaching from counseling, and we're going to come back to these concepts throughout the remainder of this module, as you're going to have to make deliberate decisions as to whether you coach or you counsel, depending on the issue that needs to be resolved. Because providing feedback is so important for an engineering leader, we're going to take a moment to reflect on what we mean by providing descriptive feedback. This is going to be feedback that is as objective as we can make it, that focuses more on the what happened as opposed to the why. And in doing so, we're going to focus on not evaluating as we do that. We're going to try to avoid accusations and focus on the what happened rather than why it happened or the motive behind it. We're going to focus on the specific behavior and your reaction to it. And in doing so, again, focusing not on personality or character, but describing as best we can how that behavior or event influences you, others, and the ability to get work done. We would like for this descriptive feedback to be forward-looking. We want to focus more on solutions than we do on the past. Don't dwell too much on the past. And in that way, we may help the individual arrive at some possible alternatives, or you may suggest some, depending on the context of the conversation. In addition to being descriptive in nature in providing feedback, how you give the feedback is critical. Attitude is everything. It's not so much what you say, but how you say it. And in that regard, when you deliver feedback, being in a higher mood state can be very effective. By this we mean a state where you are optimistic and hopeful, as opposed to a lower mood state where you are impatient, depressed, or even angry. That higher mood state will allow you to have more perspective, and it will allow you to feel in control of the situation instead of being controlled by it. And that means that you'll be able to keep your bearings despite the emotional turmoil that can result by approaching the sensitive line of the people that you're providing feedback to. It'll mean that you can listen more deeply. You'll be able to tune in to the emotional content, the nuances of the words that are used, and hear those hidden meanings. It'll allow you to focus on the bigger picture, and in the long run, it will help you to influence others much more effectively. In the previous lectures, we focused on some characteristics of delivering feedback. Now it's useful to think a little bit about what happens when this is unskillfully delivered. What are the consequences of not delivering feedback in an artful and skillful manner? Well, first of all, if it comes across as abrasive or insensitive, it's going to result in creating a distant relationship, one where trust is potentially destroyed, and actually damage the interpersonal relationships involved in that feedback discussion. When that happens, the information flow will be disrupted. You may not get good flow, and the information that is transmitted may not be very good. When this situation occurs, it's what I describe as generating toxic waste. And this toxic waste can be re-injected into the feedback loop and create even more difficulties upstream. This is when you approach the death spiral of destroying relationships, destroying trust, and resulting in a very ineffective organization. As we reflect some more on the impact of unskillful communication, we can categorize the response of the person receiving feedback in an unskillful way into two broad categories. The first is defensiveness, and secondly, disconfirmation. In the situation of defensiveness, the individual feels personally attacked and may actually feel personally threatened, and that can happen when the feedback is delivered in an overly aggressive manner. In the case of disconfirmation, this is where the person receiving the feedback feels insecure or inadequate, or their self-worth is in jeopardy. and this can arise when the feedback provided is more evaluative in nature. In the case of defensiveness, the individual may respond somewhat aggressively in order to protect themselves. In the case of disconfirmation, they're going to act in ways to help reestablish their self-worth. In the case of defensiveness, energy is going to be expended defending themselves, and as a result, they're going to focus more on that than on listening. In the case of disconfirmation, they're going to try to reestablish their value, and as a result, devote more energy to that than on listening. In the defensiveness case, the person receiving that unskillful feedback will become aggressive, and as a result, maybe even avoid the communication. In the case of the disconfirmation, they're going to show off. They're going to act out in ways that help them reestablish their value. As you think about these situations, it's important to remember that how you deliver feedback is going to be most important to overcoming the potential inhibitors and result in you being much more effective as you deliver feedback. As an engineering leader, you will need to provide honest and accurate feedback to your followers without damaging the interpersonal relationships that are essential to accomplishing the work that needs to be done. As you do this, you'll want to consider supportive communications strategies. We'll step through these one by one. First, congruence. If the message that you're delivering is not consistent with the body language, the tone, and the attitude that you're projecting, then you will create confusion in the mind of the person receiving the feedback. So as you contemplate providing feedback or messages to your followers, ensure that you give some consideration to the congruence of the situation. As we talked about earlier, being descriptive, not evaluative in the way you provide the feedback, will allow you to be much more objective and, again, honest in the feedback that you provide. Focusing on the problem as opposed to the person. When you focus on the person, you raise the risk of rising the emotional level and potentially crossing the other person's sensitive line. Focusing on the problem rather than the person will help prevent that from happening. When you provide feedback, do it in a validating way, one that is respectful of the person receiving the feedback. Again, be specific. As we talked about in the goal-setting process, without specific goals, it's hard to understand when you've completed a task or achieved the goal. In the case of providing feedback, if it is not specific, it will not be actionable, and the individual won't be able to respond in a way that you desire. Conjunctive. When you're providing feedback, make sure that as you do so, the flow of that conversation flows logically from one step to the next. If you're disjunctive in nature, you'll run the potential of losing the follower in the course of the conversation, and as a result, send a confusing message. As you provide feedback, make sure that you own the feedback, and by that I mean you should be using I statements. Not they said or I heard, but I think, I believe, I observe. These would be appropriate kinds of approaches to demonstrate ownership of the message that you're sending. These then are the strategies that you might contemplate using as you're providing feedback, all as a way for you to build the trust that you need to be an effective leader. Delivering feedback is not all about speaking. It involves listening techniques that will help you build trust and reinforce the relationships of those to whom you're providing feedback. We start with active listening techniques. We talked about these at some length in the personal interview that we did in the self-awareness course in Module 2. Here we're talking about making eye contact, listening and acknowledging, using appropriate gestures, and asking follow-up questions. These are all techniques that you can use to demonstrate that you are engaged in the conversation and not distant or aloof, and that you're paying attention to the messages that you're receiving. As far as the questions that you might ask, you might want to ask elaboration questions to tell more about. A statement that you might use in that regard would be, can you tell me more? You might use clarification questions. If the message isn't clear and you want a little more definition, then you might ask a clarification question. And you can do this by saying, let me check what I heard and see if it matches what you intended. You can paraphrase and restate. I like to use paraphrasing statements as a way of demonstrating that I understand the message that was sent. A second kind of listening skill that you'll use in providing feedback will be the supportive listening techniques. But before we discuss those, let's review the kinds of responses that you may have in the give and take of a feedback conversation. The first may be the advising response. This is fairly directive in nature, where you're providing information or direction to the person receiving the feedback. Next may be the deflecting response, where from time to time you may need to change the subject, particularly in those circumstances where the person receiving the feedback shifts and you need to redirect back to the issue at hand. There may be the probing response. Similar to active listening, you may have to respond in ways to get more information, clarification, for example. Or you may simply use a reflecting response in which you mirror the comments of the person that you're advising or coaching or counseling. These techniques are ranged from most directive to least directive and are going to be matched to the kind of conversation that you're having, whether it's a coaching conversation or a counseling conversation. So in that regard, let's now look at supportive listening. As we think about it, there are four different categories of supporting listening here that we're going to describe. One is very directive, characteristic of what we've described earlier as coaching, and then a non-directive one that may be more appropriate to a counseling situation. This corresponds to closed versus open conversations. Closed, very directive, under the control of the person providing the feedback. Open, where the person providing the feedback lets the person receiving the feedback do most of the talking. As you might expect, the listening styles or response styles that I described a moment ago use the advising style in the more directive approaches, whether it's the coaching style or the closed. Next, more directive is the deflecting style. Again, the person providing the feedback takes control of the conversation to direct it in a new way or to move it away from a prior subject. In the probing response, this is less directive, but may give the person providing the feedback an opportunity to get more information and encourage the person receiving the feedback to speak up and talk more and open up in the conversation. The least directive technique response to in providing feedback is going to be that reflecting one. Here, the person providing the feedback actually does very little communication and uses this approach to encourage the person receiving the feedback to arrive at their own conclusions and own solutions to the issues that are being discussed. As we think about active and supportive listening, these are ways that you can help build trust and confidence in the persons that you're providing feedback and thereby improve the interpersonal relationships in your team and in your organization. We spent a great deal of time in this module talking about giving feedback. What happens when the shoe is on the other foot and you are in the position of receiving feedback? This might occur in those formal occasions, perhaps a semi-annual or annual performance review, or even informal occasions where you're receiving feedback from your manager. How might you think about preparing for that in such a way that it is supportive? And many of the same concepts that we've talked about in providing feedback also apply to receiving feedback. In particular, I hope that by this time you understand clearly that providing feedback requires significant preparation and thought. You can't go into a feedback session without having organized your thoughts, What is the message? What's the setting? To make sure that they're congruent and consistent so that you effectively transmit the message. Being on the receiving end is no different. You have to be prepared. You have to understand what work needs to be done ahead of time before you actually go into that session. In many cases, you might actually have described your accomplishments or goals before you ever go into that session. Having a clear picture of those is important so that you are prepared to present your message on your own behalf. As you receive feedback, also listen actively, as we described in the case of providing feedback. Here you may have to ask clarifying questions, probing questions, or elaboration so that you clearly understand the message that's being sent. You should never leave a feedback session being unclear about what was said and any actions that need to be taken. As you approach receiving feedback, tune into your own emotional state. Are you on one of those higher mood states or a lower one? If you're on the higher one, you're going to be more receptive to receiving that feedback and aware of where you are so that you can keep your emotions in check and receive those messages effectively. As I said with active listening, ask the right probing questions. Make sure that, again, you have clarity and understanding before you lead the session. Receiving feedback is all about getting the information that you need so that you can reshape your goals and your actions so that you can become more effective. At this point in the module, you've already had the opportunity to take the self-assessments on communication style and also had an opportunity to record your reflections about it in your journal. Now I'd like to share with you my own results from the communication style. As I look at these results, what I see is a fairly controlling aspect of the way that I communicate. As I look at the deflecting high score that I got on this assessment, that's an artifact, I think, of my years as a campus interviewer where I had to take control of the conversations to get the information that I needed to do a successful interview. As part of being a manager and leader in other circumstances, I had a fairly high advising and probing approach to my communication style that I think was appropriate in those circumstances. What you see here is a very low score on the deflecting side, and perhaps that's something that as I continue to work on my leadership and communication style, I might want to devote some attention to. Welcome to the Leadership Tools segment for this module. Here I would like to present to you a checklist that you can use to decide when to use counseling or when to use coaching. First, you'll need to decide whether the issue at hand is a performance issue. If it's performance, you're going to be using coaching. If it's behavior, you'll be using counseling. But recognize that when formal coaching no longer works, it becomes a behavior issue and counseling will be necessary. Is the issue an early observation, meaning it's a first-time occurrence, or is this a chronic issue, a repeated behavior? If it's a first-time occurrence, then you're going to be using an informal approach, maybe verbal versus written. But as it becomes a chronic issue, more formality will be required to address the problem at hand. Frequently here, you'll be using a very formal approach with written outcomes recorded for purposes of use later on. Is the issue severe or minor? If it's a minor issue, informal counseling is very appropriate, but as the severity increases, so does the need for more formality in the kind of feedback provided. Remember that formal counseling, the most severe form of counseling that you may ever have to engage in, usually requires that you get subject matter expertise from your human resources department or from legal or others who are familiar with similar kinds of experiences. These situations are ones that you should not go into without having the benefit of help from others. I've captured these concepts in the form of this matrix, where I show counseling along the lower level and coaching along the top, and when you might use these. Counseling for behavior issues, coaching for performance issues. I also reflect, is this an early observation or a chronic issue? For early observations, those that have occurred once or twice in the past, you're going to use an informal approach. You may or may not document the outcomes of the feedback, and you're going to use a probing approach to clarify the issues and help the individual understand the issues at hand. As performance or behavior become more chronic in nature, then you're going to move to a more formal approach to providing the feedback. And in fact, when a behavior problem becomes so severe or so chronic, that then becomes a performance issue and has to be addressed in a much more formal way. There, the feedback will be very directive, very formal, and always will be documented, because the potential is that the outcome will be termination of employment. You can use this approach to decide when to use coaching and counseling and the nature, the formality of the feedback that you'll be giving. If you use this, you may find it easier to provide the appropriate level of feedback and be consistent with the aims and needs of your organization. Welcome to the journaling segment of our first module in the Relationship Management course. Today we're coming to you from the Brockman Patio. This is a place where students and faculty occasionally come to sit, relax, study, converse with other members of the Rice community. During this course, I'll be coming to you from this patio as a way of, again, sharing some of the experience of being on the Rice campus. Today, my first journaling story will come from my personal experience at Shell. Early in my career, I had a manager who was relatively new to the job as being a manager. He was very skilled technically, and he was also skilled as a manager, but had a very direct, abrasive style in communicating with his staff. It was a my way or the highway kind of approach. While he was skilled, this very disagreeable part of his communication style led to a little bit of resentment and also mistrust within the group that he led. He wasn't very bashful about using intimidation when he needed. So as a result, behind his back, he became known as the Hammer. I had occasion throughout my career to work with this manager, and over time he seemed to evolve a bit. And as a result, he became a little bit softer and a little bit mellower. However, the marks that he made early in that career remained with him throughout, and I was never fully able to trust his motives. While I was able to work with him, it was difficult at times because I wasn't sure if he was being genuine or if he was being manipulative. This is a clear case of where the tools that we've been talking about in communications, and we'll talk about later on in this course, can be misused and abused and lead to creating the perception of being manipulated as opposed to being genuine and trustful. So I caution you, while these tools are going to be extremely useful, there is a dark side. We've now reached the end of our first module in the Relationship Management course. So it's time to review my leadership observation. You remember that I said that bad leaders get people hurt, whether it's physically, emotionally, or spiritually. The flip side of that is that first aid may heal the wounds of bad leadership, but the scars never go away. You will remember bad leaders for the rest of your life. Now let's take a look at what we covered in this module. We talked about coaching versus counseling, when to use these, and understanding that coaching is used for performance-related issues and counseling for behavior. We talked extensively about providing feedback and ways that you can do that so that you reinforce relationships and build trust. We talked about the effects of unskilled communication and how that can destroy trust and relationships. We reviewed some supportive strategies that you can use to reinforce providing feedback, both active listening and supportive listening. Then we talked about when the shoe is on the other foot, how do you receive feedback and how can you prepare yourself to receive feedback and act on it effectively. I then provided you a checklist that you can use when you're in the situation where you're providing feedback to others, a deliberate process that you can use to be more effective in providing feedback. This is the hard stuff of leadership. Like riding a bicycle, you don't get better at it unless you practice. Welcome to Module 2 of our course on managing relationships. In this module, we will talk extensively about using appropriately power and influence. We'll take time to not only define our terms, but also to recognize when power and influence are being used inappropriately or in an abusive way. Before we do that, however, let's take a look at my leadership observation for this module. Sometimes it helps to be a good actor in order to be an effective leader. Sometimes you just have to act the part. We'll return to that observation at the end of the module. Our objectives for this module are first to define the terms of power and influence. What are they? Where do they come from? We'll want to recognize when power and influence are being abused and develop some strategies for you to defend yourself against the abuse of power. We'll recognize and understand strategies for how you're going to gain the power you need to get work done. In the engineering world, work doesn't get done without some exercise appropriately of power and influence. We'll describe the sources of organizational power. Where do they come from and how do you build that in an effective and appropriate way? We'll learn to recognize the influence strategies that managers can use to get work done, to influence the work of others so that we accomplish the goals of the organization effectively. However, those influence strategies can be abused, and there may come occasions when you have to use appropriate countervailing strategies to overcome inappropriate use of the influence strategies. I recognize that the content of this module has a distinctly Western cultural flavor. In other cultures, you may have to exercise power and influence in somewhat different ways. However, here, power and influence are key to developing an internal locus of control and a positive leadership self-efficacy. Now let's begin our discussion of power and influence by defining our terms. Power is the ability to exert force on others to accomplish certain actions or behaviors. Many times this takes the form of threats or intimidations and as such can represent an abuse of power. We're more accustomed to seeing power used as the ability to direct the behavior of others to accomplish the goals of the organization. In this form, it may or may not be abusive. So what then is influence? Influence is the ability to have an effect on the outcome, either on the development of others, their behavior, or events themselves. So why is power and influence important? Well, first of all, having power allows us to act in ways that benefit others and ourselves, and as a result, the entire organization. We can be stronger advocates for ourselves in getting those things that we need to accomplish our goals and to achieve our aspirations. We can get our ideas recognized, not only recognized, but implemented in the organization. We can influence decisions in positive ways and ways that benefit our team, ourselves, and the organization. We can be recognized by key people. A fundamental element of success is that recognition that you receive from others that acknowledge your skills, expertise, and abilities. Being able to be a strong advocate for yourself and having that power and influence will allow you to get the resources that are essentially important to you to accomplish your goals. And as such, with your alignment of goals for the good of the organization, to achieve the overall organizational goals. We define political competence as having the ability to get your ideas acted upon when others can't get them. As I said earlier, power and influence in other cultures do have a negative connotation. However, here we view power and influence in a positive way so that when it is used appropriately, it can help us accomplish not only our goals, but those of the organization. Let's take some time now to examine the relationship between performance and personal power. As a way of doing that, let's plot on our x-axis personal power from low to high. And then along the y-axis, personal performance. As we look at this plot, we can imagine what the shape of this curve might be. At the low end, where power is low, or inadequate, we might expect performance also to be low. Conversely, at the high end, where we have too much power, we might expect, again, performance not to be optimal because of the potential for abuse. Somewhere in between is that place where power is sufficient and we have enough to get the job done. So, one view of this relationship might be that it is a curve achieving an optimum somewhere between inadequate and too much power. This is the point on the curve, the high point on the curve, that we would call empowered. That is the place where you have sufficient power to get the job done and yet not risk underperforming or abusing the power that you do have. With that in mind, let's take a look at the sources of personal power. Power derives either from personal characteristics or from your place in the organization, and we would call that positional power. As we think about personal power, we can imagine that one source of that is your personal expertise. All of you got where you are as engineers by having certain skills in math, science. Those skills allowed you to have a certain expertise that is valued by your organization. That alone affords you some power. Those who accrue even greater expertise also accrue some power. You could have certain physical characteristics that make you attractive to others and can be regarded as a source of power. You may be able to tune in to the emotional needs of others, identify with what their aspirations are, and in that way demonstrate social and emotional intelligence that give you what we would call charisma. You may dedicate more effort than is needed for particular assignments. You may go that extra mile to get things done. When that is recognized, that can also be a source of power. You may get power simply because what you do aligns with the needs of others, with the needs of the organization. The fact that you are working in ways that helps the organization succeed will be a source of power for you. So what then might be the sources of power from a positional perspective? Well, first, depending on where you are in the network formed by your organization, you may be able to be in a position to observe the flow of information or the flow of resources in such a way that if you are at the center of that flow, you gain some power, but not only from the knowledge, but from the ability to influence where that information goes and how resources are used. Depending on the amount of autonomy that you have, the flexibility you have in making decisions can also be a source of power. The greater the flexibility that you have in your organization to make decisions, the greater will be your power. If your position in the organization affords you the opportunity to be visible to key decision makers in the hierarchy of the organization, that will give you personal credibility, positional credibility, and as a result, greater power. If the work that you are doing in the organization is directly related to the success or the outcomes for the organization, we call that relevance. And to the extent that your work is aligned closely with the mission of the organization, you will derive power from that situation. As we think about personal power and reflect back on our discussions of communication in Module 1, You should also recognize that supportive communication is also a key to establishing personal power. The fact that you can make others feel important through coaching and counseling effectively, help them accomplish their goals and tasks, and as a result, build trust with them will be a significant source of personal power. These then are the sources of power that you will want to consider, both the personal and the positional ones in your organization. You're going to want to take decisive action to build both the personal and positional powers in order to get things done and accomplish your goals. As we reflect on the need to exert influence to accomplish personal goals or organizational goals, we should consider that there are three distinct influence strategies. We call these the 3 R's: retribution, reciprocity, and reason. The circumstances at any given time will dictate which of these influence strategies is most appropriate. Tuning your choice of strategy to the particular situation will have significant impact on the outcome. Let's examine these in a little more detail. We begin with retribution. This strategy most closely represents a forcing approach to getting others to do what you want them to do. It may involve coercion or even threats, and frequently intimidation. Most of us are familiar with this influence strategy from our personal lives. It's not uncommon that parents will use retribution as an influence strategy to get the behavior they want from their children. It frequently involves the threat of punishment. Some of the ways that retribution is actually employed are the direct threats that I mentioned previously. You may find that retribution is used in those situations where there is not time to adopt another strategy. In a crisis situation, retribution may be the only way that the leader can exert the influence needed to resolve the crisis. You can imagine that in situations where retribution is used, that it stifles creativity, the ability of others to bring their ideas to the table in creative and potentially valuable ways, but it also, if it becomes a pattern on the part of the leader, then it will create resentment within the organization and can be counterproductive and destructive to the trust that needs to be built between the leader and the followers in the organization. As we think about reciprocity, this approach to influence typically involves negotiation and is a way that leaders can help others achieve what both the leader and the follower desire. It does involve bargaining, an exchange of one thing of value for another, as we would call that a quid pro quo. The leader may choose to reward behaviors that they desire in order to create a feeling of obligation on the part of the follower. Typical ways that reciprocity might be used are reflected here, but usually involve that reciprocal compromise. The leader promises to do something for the follower in return for the desired behavior from the follower. Both of them feel that there is value in that exchange, so the exchange makes sense. One of the difficulties of using this frequently in your leadership style and your approach to influence is that it can create a pattern of behavior, an expectation that all behavior is going to be rewarded in a certain way. This can be counterproductive to the effectiveness of the organization and may limit your effectiveness as a leader as you reach the end of appropriate rewards that you can provide. That precedent can be problematic. Our last influence strategy is that of reason. We use this approach when we want to build consensus between the leader and the follower. As a result, we want to use this to show others that it makes sense to do what we want them to do. It will rely heavily on logic and objectively presenting the facts. And ultimately, what it achieves is good alignment of both personal organizational and the leader's goals in such a way that we build trust, confidence, loyalty within the organization. As you might expect, this approach takes time. It takes a significant amount of effort in order to achieve the desired outcomes. However, its chief advantage is that it does build that consensus that leads to the achievement of common goals of the leader and the follower. These then are the 3 R's of influence strategies. Try not to rely solely on one or another, as frequent reliance on one creates a pattern that can create problems in achieving the organizational goals. Learn to adapt and use each of these strategies appropriately. Up to this point in this module, we've talked extensively about how leaders exert influence and power over their subordinates. What about those situations where the subordinate needs to exert upward influence? Here we show 2 examples of where that might be necessary. The first is selling an idea. When you have an idea or a proposal that needs to be approved by your manager, then you're going to have to sell upward. What about those situations where your manager is abusing the power and influence that he's exerting on you? These might be cases where you need to neutralize their influence strategy attempts. We'll take some time now to examine each of these approaches. In selling issues upward, there are a number of particular approaches to this. You're going to be faced with many circumstances as an engineer and as an engineering leader where you have to convince those leaders above you to take action. In those cases, there are a number of considerations that you need to keep in mind. First, congruence. Congruence means that what you're asking for is consistent with the needs of the organization. You're not asking for something that is unusual or outside the bounds of what your organization would normally do. Credibility, you have to present the information in an honest and open way. You can't hide information that might adversely affect the outcome of the decision. When you communicate, you're going to have to consider multiple lines of communication, not just face-to-face, but perhaps written, email, any form of communication where you can use multiple lines to get your idea presented to the appropriate decision makers. Compatibility. The idea has to be consistent with the needs of the organization. If it isn't, it won't align with the goals and direction that the organization is taking. In order to get the idea received positively, it will have to be able to be solved within the organization. So you have to present the information in such a way that you can convince the leaders that it is doable within the organization. I believe that one of the most powerful arguments in support of any idea that you might have is to show clearly what it's worth to the organization, thus the payoff. How is it valuable? And to the extent that you can do so, quantify that in actual currency. You should convince your leaders that the expertise necessary to solve the problem resides within the organization. You don't have to go outside in order to make it work. Responsibility refers to reminding the senior decision makers that it is their obligation to act to solve particular issues at hand, and that the ideas that you're presenting may offer a potential solution. When you present your proposal, whatever form that might be in, you must ensure that it is clear and logical and complete in presenting the facts, and yet not so detailed that you get lost in the amount of detail. Simple enough that you can convey the idea clearly and concisely. You may choose to combine a particular idea or proposal with others that are similar. We call this bundling, in such a way that you can sell a group of ideas much more effectively than you might individual ones. To the extent that you can have multiple avenues for others to see the idea, that improves the visibility of it and makes the idea known more broadly. thus creating some drive towards addressing the needs presented by the idea. You might consider building a coalition. I refer to this as finding the champions for the idea. Frequently in your organization, you might not have the necessary power and influence to get an idea addressed, but there may be others who could be an ally in your effort to sell a particular idea. And this would be the coalition building. So we've talked about positive ways of influencing upward. What about those situations where your manager, your leader, abuses power and uses influence strategies in ways that have negative consequences for you? These are situations where you may need to neutralize those influence strategies. Let's examine retribution. Recall that this is the situation where the leader uses coercion to get what he wants. In these situations, you can choose to point out to the leader that you are mutually dependent, that you rely on each other to get both individual and organizational goals. This is called the using countervailing power to show that mutual dependence. You might have to confront the leader, pointing out the behavior. I would suggest that in these situations, this is another opportunity to use supportive communication, to use those I feel statements, and to point out the consequences of the behavior on you. As a last resort, you may have to actively resist. In these situations, you may need to be prepared to escalate the issue beyond your first line leader. What then about reciprocity? When you experience reciprocity from your leader, you may have to understand more clearly what the motives are behind that particular approach to influence. You should examine what is the purpose and what are the expectations. If you believe that those intentions are respectful and trustworthy, then you may choose to accept them. Otherwise, you may have to confront the individual in such a way that you point out the consequences again of what they're doing and what the long-term outcomes might be of that particular approach. Again, this is an opportunity to use those supportive communication techniques. As a last resort, you may refuse to bargain, particularly when your manager or leader is using high-pressure tactics to get what they want. This again represents a situation where you may have to choose to escalate that issue above your manager. What about those cases where your manager is using reason, yet the logic that they are using contradicts your personal values and your objectives? You may have to use reason yourself to point out the adverse impact of what the leader wants on your performance or the achievement of your goals. You may have to defend yourself proactively and explain in very logical ways what the impact is on you and what you desire to be a preferable outcome. And lastly, again, as before with the other influence strategies, you may have to refuse to comply. Again, this represents a situation where you will need to be prepared to escalate this issue beyond your manager. These then have been the opportunities that you may have to use to influence upward in your organization, whether it's to sell ideas or to counteract the abuse of power through the three influence strategies. In this module, you completed a self-assessment on your influence style. I suspect that as you did that, you identified a dominant style in your approach to exerting power and influence. Let me share with you my own self-assessment. In mine, what you see is that dominant style is one of reason. I like dealing with facts. That's consistent with not only my occupation as an engineer, but also my personality, where I tend to be low on the neuroticism scale, stay calm in situations, and am able to deal with facts related to a particular situation. As you develop as leaders, you're going to have to consider not only your dominant style, but developing skill in the other areas as well so that you can tune your influence style to the needs of the particular situation. 100 years ago, Dale Carnegie wrote his influential book, How to Win Friends and Influence People. While it wasn't based in rigorous academic research, it collected the lessons that he had learned through his years as a salesman. In it, he expressed that there were 3 fundamentals in dealing with people, and one of those was expressing genuine appreciation. The keys to doing that, he said, were that it had to be sincere. If not, it would come across as phony. It had to be for some meaningful interaction that resulted in a benefit to the individual expressing the appreciation. It had to be personalized in a way that clearly identified the consequences in a positive way. And it had to be timely. It had to be tied quickly to the events that led to that expression of appreciation. The leadership tool for this module is the thank you note. Dale Carnegie suggested that this was a lost art. If you can get in the practice of writing thank you notes, you will separate yourself from most of your contemporaries. As you do so, you should think about handwriting your notes if at all possible. In today's world, it is too easy to write an email or an electronic form of communication. The handwritten note reflects the concern of the individual to take the time to express that appreciation. That reflects very favorably on the person giving the appreciation. Use the person's name in the greeting of the thank you note. People like hearing their own names, and they like to know that it's specifically addressed to them as opposed to somebody else. Make sure that you say thank you in the letter, and the more times that you can do that, the better. Make sure that you address the consequences of the service provided by the individual as you say thankful. This helps personalize the note in a way that will be easily recognized by the receiver. And lastly, make sure that you close politely and respectfully and sign the note. In a world of increasing reliance on electronic media for exchanging information and communicating, writing personal thank you notes, handwriting personal thank you notes, will demonstrate a personal style and grace that is uncommon and will separate you from all of your contemporaries. Welcome to the journaling segment of Module 2 for our Relationship Management course. We're coming to you again from the Brockman patio. Today I have an example of power and influence from my career that illustrates upward selling. Late in my career, I had an opportunity to work on a process development effort. It was directed at an entirely new way to make one of our existing products. It involved designing, building, and operating a large pilot plant at our technology center. It was large enough and handled hazardous enough materials that there was some potential risk that had to be addressed as we considered our design. In order to put the whole pilot plant together, I assembled a project team that spent over a year in doing the detailed design, doing the cost estimates, finding a location on the site where we could logistically support the pilot plant, recruiting the staff that was going to be necessary because this pilot plant would operate 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. As such, there were significant safety concerns that had to be addressed. So we put together a detailed plan, including contingencies, risk mitigation strategies, all in an effort to make sure that we had addressed all of the factual concerns that management might be interested in. And while we did that very successfully and communicated those ideas, ultimately it turned out that it wasn't the facts that would sell the idea. In the end, it turned out to be some of the intangible benefits of this process that ultimately swayed senior management to support the overall effort. As it turned out, senior management wanted to be technology leaders, and that was the key selling point that made this particular project a success. In the end, we did build, operate, and run an experimental program on that pilot plant that lasted for over 5 years. Congratulations, we've now reached the end of Module 2 in our Relationship Management course. It's time now to return to my leadership observation for this module. Sometimes it helps to be a good actor to be an effective leader. However, you can't fake it forever. If you try to, you'll come across as a phony and damage your reputation as a leader. So here's what we've covered in this module. We defined power and influence, and we established that you will have to use these techniques in order to accomplish your goals and the goals of your organization. We identified the sources of power, whether it's personal or those powers that derive as a result of your position in the organization. We talked about the 3 influence strategies that you will need to use as a leader to get the things done that need to be done, whether it's retribution, reciprocity, or reason. We also described how you might have to act when a leader above you abuses those influence strategies. You may need to neutralize those in such a way that you protect your rights and your values within the organization. We then reviewed the self-assessments that show where we are and our tendencies in how we use power and influence. Lastly, I talked in the tools section about the power of saying thank you and the fact that this is an extraordinary tool in extending your influence in the organization. Of all of the techniques that we've described for becoming an effective leader, the one that is most fraught with risk is that of exercising power. It has the potential to create great harm within your organization, so I encourage you to use great caution as you develop your skills in using power and influence appropriately to reinforce positive relationships without creating harm. Welcome to Module 3 in our Relationship Management course. In this module, we will be covering a topic that I feel is one of the most difficult leadership subjects to master: managing conflict. As we do so, I'd like for you to look for the connections to our first 2 modules in this course: communication and managing power and influence. I think you'll find some interesting connections. Before we proceed, let's take a look at my leadership observation for this module. Because leadership involves people, it's inherently messy. We'll come back to that observation again at the end of the module. Now let's take a look at the objectives for this module. First, we will want to examine the effect of conflict on the organization. Is it inherently good or bad? We'll want to focus on the types of conflict that can arise, as well as the sources, and there is a difference. We'll look at the different approaches that you as a leader can use in resolving conflict. And then, finally, we will devote considerable attention to a collaborative approach to resolving conflict. How well you manage conflict will in large part determine the long-term health of your team or your organization. As I said earlier, as a leader, you will find that you will spend a considerable portion of your time resolving conflicts. So in that regard, it's worth taking a moment to look at the impact of conflict on your organization and then analyze the sources of that conflict. If we look at the impact of conflict on the organization, we might imagine that at the low end of the scale, low conflict, this is an area where conflict is avoided. Over time, this can have a significant negative impact on the organization as frustrations build up, as the ability to address that conflict are not taken care of, and this certainly would result in low efficiency in the organization. At the high end of the conflict scale, here the high emotional level and intensity of those emotions is going to result in what I call organizational churn, turmoil in the organization. And at this point, again, the effectiveness of the organization drops off very low. So we see at both ends of the scale, organizational effectiveness is low. So somewhere in between, there must be an optimum. Where is that level of conflict that allows you to get the work done and yet prevents damage to relationships or damage to getting the work done that needs to be done? This particular point is different from organization to organization. Your challenge as a leader is going to be to find that optimum so that your organization manages that level of conflict while still getting work done. Now let's look closer at conflict. And as we analyze it, we're going to be looking for the focus of the conflict and the sources. As we think about the focus of the conflict, this really refers to, is this a people-centered or is it an issue-centered focus? For people-focused ones, these are interpersonal conflicts, could result from personality differences, values differences, and these are going to be the ones that are the most challenging to resolve because frequently severe people-focused conflict will result in permanently damaging relationships. Issue-focused conflicts tend to be easier to resolve as facts and reason can often be used to help resolve these kinds of conflicts. Now let's shift our attention to the sources of conflict. The first of these is personal differences. These could be personality, values, or even generational differences. We could be operating under different sets of information or even misinformation. This can cause confusion and frustration and thus result in conflict. Sometimes our goals are incompatible with our role in the organization. We may be asked to do things that are just not appropriate for our particular role in the organization. That again creates tension, frustration, and potentially conflict. There may be conditions within our organization that can induce stress as well. Typical examples of these are when organizations are trying to operate under austere conditions and there are budget or resource constraints, or even in economic hard times when there are threats of staff reductions. Those are all cases where stress in the organization can go up and conflict can be an outcome. Each of us develops our own approach to managing conflict. This would be called our personal conflict management style. It's how we deal with negotiations, and it's formed early in life and is grounded not only in our personality, but in our experiences that we develop over time as we learn more and more from dealing with conflicts that arise. Because we tend to rely on a preferred conflict management style, that can be a strength because we have experience with it, but it can also create a vulnerability when we don't use the appropriate conflict management style for the situation. There's no best way to deal with conflict, and I think you'll find as a leader that you're going to have to find what works in certain situations. This really is the art part of being an effective leader. As we think about the different conflict management styles, we can put these on an assertiveness versus cooperativeness scale. Let's start with the avoiding conflict style. In this particular case, the parties to the conflict may just choose to not engage. In that case, low assertive, low cooperativeness doesn't require the active participation of either party, and that would be the avoiding style. To borrow the language from Stephen Covey, this would be the equivalent of the lose-lose solution to resolving the conflict. As we move up the assertiveness scale, we come to the forcing style. Here, the person with the greater power will enforce a decision on others around him to resolve the conflict. You should recognize in this particular style the connections to communication and to power and influence. This would be a closed communication style and would be probably a retribution style of power and influence. In the Stephen Covey language, this would be the win-lose solution. As we approach the accommodating style, this would be low assertiveness, high cooperativeness. This literally is giving in to a decision maker in resolving the conflict. This, in the Stephen Covey language, would be the lose-win solution. As we think about compromise, here each party to the conflict gets something out of it, but not fully satisfied. In this particular context, I like to call this the half-win, half-win solution. As we think of being high on the assertive scale, high on the cooperative scale. These are situations where both parties are intensely interested in coming up with a solution that's acceptable to both. In the Stephen Covey language, this would be the win-win solution. With these conflict management styles in mind, let's take a look at some of the consideration that go into selecting the appropriate conflict management style for the situation. The first of these might be the level of importance of the issue at hand. Is it important? Is it not? We might choose a style based on preserving the relationship between the parties. If the relationship importance is high, then we might choose one style over another. What's the relative power? Is the decision maker high or low in power compared to other parties involved in the negotiation? And how urgent is resolving the situation? If it's very urgent, we might choose one style over another. So let's begin by examining each of the conflict resolution styles. We start with forcing. In this particular case, this might be used in situations where the issue is extremely important, the maintaining the relationship concern is not important right now, but might be later, the relative power is high, and there are time constraints, significant time constraints. What this begins to look like is a style that might be used in a crisis situation where the leader has to be directive in nature to get conflict resolved. As I said before, this in the Covey language would be the win-lose solution. So there are potential consequences if this is used frequently over a long period of time, as it may damage relationships. Let's now move on to the accommodating style. This would be used in circumstances where the issue's importance is relatively low, where it's important to preserve harmony in the relationship, where the relative power differences are low, and we're not overly constrained by the amount of time available. This might be used in a circumstance where one party concedes to the other and is typically referred to in the Covey language as a lose-win solution. Now we move on to the compromising style of conflict resolution. This might be used in circumstances where the relative importance of the issue is medium importance of maintaining a relationship, equal power differences, and low time constraints. So in this particular solution, it's important that both parties come out of the negotiation with something, and therefore is referred to as the half-win, half-win solution. Compromise is going to be an important one in many circumstances where each of the parties feels like they got something out of the negotiation. As we move on to the collaborating style, this will be a style that is most appropriate when the issue is extremely high importance to both parties, where managing the relationship in such a way that it is not damaged and is preserved is extremely important. There may or may not be a power difference involved, and as a result, this is going to look a lot like supportive communication, and where you have ample time to resolve differences. This takes a great deal of negotiating skill and will take time to implement, so may not be appropriate in a crisis situation. We finally come to the avoiding style. Here, typically, the issue may be low importance. The parties just choose not to fight over something that's not important, where the relationship difference or preserving the relationship isn't particularly important, where the power differences might be equal, and moderate time constraints. Sometimes we just choose not to engage in conflict over an issue that is of low importance, and that's typical of the avoiding style. However, this can be a severe problem if the issue actually is of greater importance and over the long term results in building of tension and frustration that can show up later on in dysfunctional ways. So, when preserving relationships is extremely important, it ought to be obvious by now that the collaborating style is going to be the preferred method of resolving conflict. We'll devote some attention to that in the next lesson. Now that we've examined the 5 approaches to conflict resolution, let's look more closely at the collaborative problem-solving approach. This will look a lot like the analytical and creative problem-solving approaches that we described earlier in this specialization. We begin with the problem identification. Here it is helpful to focus on the facts involved as opposed to evaluations or positions. It's going to be very helpful here as well to share common goals. What does each party expect to gain out of this collaborative approach? It also helps if we try to maintain a neutral power difference between the parties involved in the resolution. Frequently in these situations, we will have an initiator of a complaint or problem, we'll have the responder, and we may actually have a third party who acts as a mediator to ensure that the process is followed closely. As we look at arriving at a collaborative solution, this should more closely resemble creative problem solving than analytical. That's going to be especially true as we look at solution generation. The more options, the more alternatives there are, the better there is a chance for success at the end of the conflict resolution. Once a resolution is determined, having a well-established action plan that can be measured and followed up upon will be very, very important. And here is where we ensure that there's agreement from both parties and where we establish the fact that a win-win solution has indeed been achieved. We then do the implementation and follow-up of the agreed-upon plans. Periodically, we may need to recheck with the parties involved to make sure that we did indeed arrive at a solution. Now let's take a look at how this would look from each of the participants' perspective, beginning with the initiator. Here, the initiator should use I statements to show that they definitely own the problem, that it's their problem and they are looking for a solution. Make sure that they, again, try to use facts, not opinions or an established position. Avoid evaluations, again, focusing on the facts. This is a time-consuming process, so patience and persistence are going to be necessary to drive this whole process to completion. When the problem is so complex or so big, you may need to divide it into smaller bite-sized pieces that can be addressed one at a time to ensure that you're making effective progress. Without that, either party involved in the negotiation may give up. From the initiator's perspective still, as we look at solutions, try to find common goals, common interests, where the parties can readily agree before you move on to the more difficult challenges of implementing changes that the initiator might require. Let's take a look now from how this might look from the responder's perspective. Here, the responder ought to try to establish a climate where they're open to communication, where they're willing to listen and not be evaluative in their judgments of what they're hearing from the initiator. They can be very helpful by asking follow-up questions, those probing questions. Here is where the supportive communication techniques will come in especially handy. Where they can find agreement, commonalities, that will be very important to show that there is progress and show that there's mutual interest in arriving at a solution. When it comes to generating solutions from the responder's perspective, the responder may want to ask the initiator for some suggestions as to how they think that issue might be resolved. Again, the responder may need to ask clarifying and probing questions to make sure that they fully understand what the initiator is asking. In those cases where there's a mediator, the mediator really needs to focus on the process that's being used by the two parties to the conflict, the initiator and the responder. They need to acknowledge the conflict and acknowledge the interests of both parties. Again, they should ensure that both parties stay focused on facts, on the interest and not on the positions of the parties involved in the negotiation. They should try to remain neutral and not take a side. One of the ways they can destroy their effectiveness is if they take a particular side and favor one party over the other. That's all part of ensuring fairness in this negotiation. When it comes to generating solutions from the mediator's perspective, they ought to ensure that as many options as possible are explored, as many alternatives are generated to ensure that there is at least some acceptable ones. When they do arrive at some solutions, ensure that both parties fully buy in. That's going to be extremely important. We don't want to leave this negotiation with one party feeling they didn't get their issues or their concerns addressed. The mediator also ought to make sure that there is a process in place for following up to make sure that in fact this conflict has been resolved. Otherwise, you'll be back renegotiating this issue at a later time. What we see in the collaborative problem-solving process is the culmination of a variety of skills that we've seen throughout this specialization. We've seen problem solving, we've seen supportive communication, and we've seen the effective use of power and influence. This is where we leave the realm of the science of leadership and enter that universe of creative and artful application of all of the skills that results in effective leadership. By way of a summary, let's take a look at an approach to collaborative problem solving that brings together the concepts we've discussed so far. In any dispute, it is helpful to start by defining the common goals that the two parties have. Here we can at least establish something that both parties agree to. By starting with those common goals, we can build a stronger structure of solutions later on. We want to focus on separating the people from the actual problems. So we want to make sure that we have good, accepted definition of what the real problems are. We'd like to make sure that we identify interests as opposed to positions. A position is a demand. An interest is what are the reasons behind the demands that a person might make. By focusing on the interest, we can get away from those demands and set the stage for generating more options as solutions. We then do want to create those options. This will involve a brainstorming approach to generating multiple options that might satisfy both parties in a dispute. We'd like to evaluate those options. Here, we're really searching for those solutions that satisfy both parties in the conflict. That is, as Stephen Covey would say, the win-win solution. Lastly, we want to make sure that we have a clear picture of what constitutes success. We want to make sure also that we focus on the real gains as opposed to any perceived losses that might be a result of the solutions chosen. Now let's integrate the initiator, the responder, and the mediator into this process. You'll recall from earlier in this module we talked about the roles of the initiator and the responder. And just by a quick review, the initiator should be using I statements to take ownership of the actions in the dispute, describing consequences as specifically and objectively as they can, making sure that they focus on issues as opposed to personalities and that they are willing to explore options with the responder. Make sure that they're open to two-way dialogue and that they are clear on what it is they want to be an outcome. On the part of the responder, it's to establish the climate so that the initiator is willing to communicate openly and clearly. The responder is the one who must ask the elaborating questions to clarify issues and make sure that both individuals achieve mutual understanding. The responder should try to find some common points of agreement so that they can build on that and ensure future success. If you are the mediator in a particular dispute between an initiator and a responder, your role is to be neutral as much as possible and to ensure that the process of working through this collaborative problem-solving approach in fact stays on track and produces the desired results. If you can use the collaborative problem-solving process effectively, you can build the stronger and more trusting relationships that you will need to be an effective leader. Many years ago, I was introduced to a concept that I think can be very useful in helping you resolve conflicts. It was first introduced by Chris Argyris and later followed up by Peter Senge in his book, The Fifth Discipline, The Art and Practice of the Learning Organization. It's called the ladder of inference. The ladder of inference is a construct that relies on a hierarchy of actions that an individual goes through to move from situational data to action. We'll take a look at this in a little more detail. We begin by looking at any particular situation where there's a wealth of data out there, facts, if you will, that are pertinent to a particular situation. An individual then might selectively pick from those facts from the situation to develop a data set of information that they will use as they proceed along the ladder of inference. As they look at that data, they will interpret the data through their set of lenses, through their values and their experiences that might help them understand the data at hand. From that, they will make some assumptions, again, based on their personal experiences of what works in a particular situation or does not. They then arrive at some conclusions about what they might wish to do, which form the basis for their beliefs about the situation. With all of that in hand, the individual then may take action. The process of going from situational data to action can occur extremely rapidly, frequently on the order of seconds. When this occurs between two individuals that view the situation differently, those individuals can both climb this ladder and arrive at taking action in a situation that results in conflict. When we arrive at that belief stage, we can actually find ourselves in a situation where we selectively pick additional data to reinforce our position, and that data may actually be very, very limited and may cause us to be stuck in this recycle loop of beliefs and selectively picking data that reinforce our particular position. When this happens, it becomes extremely difficult to open up from a closed position. If we examine this from the perspective of two people climbing the ladder using different sets of lenses for interpretation, arriving at conclusions, and arriving at different beliefs, it's easy to see where they might arrive at taking action in a situation that results in conflict. So how then do we resolve that conflict? One of the best ways is to figure out steps to move down the ladder of inference to places on that ladder where you can test mutual understanding. Frequently, this is at the data level itself, where we can test mutual understanding of the facts involved in the particular situation. We use tools such as reflection, advocacy, and inquiry to test the veracity of those facts. The skills of each individual in using those techniques will help determine the effectiveness of resolving the conflict. So when is it that we know we need to move down this ladder of inference? I'll suggest to you that the moment that you begin to feel the tension that comes along with conflict, the stress that you begin to feel, that could be a signal that you need to examine those beliefs and conclusions and assumptions that you've made to move up the ladder of inference. Using a process that's referred to as reflection, you may want to move down that ladder by examining much more critically what those conclusions, assumptions, interpretations have been to arrive at a better picture of what the facts are. You can do this individually without the other person being particularly skilled in moving down the ladder of inference. And in doing so, you can be proactive in helping to manage the conflict. When both individuals are skilled in moving down the ladder of inference, the use of advocacy and inquiry skills helps clarify information so that mutual understanding is achieved. As I said earlier, you may have to move to that data level to make sure that you're looking at the same facts in the same way and then proceed to generate mutually agreeable interpretations and assumptions and ultimately to arrive at mutually acceptable actions. If you can apply the lessons of moving down the ladder of inference effectively in resolving conflict, this could actually form a first step to moving to a much more rigorous collaborative problem-solving process that will more effectively eliminate conflict situations in your environment. If you can do this, you will be a much more effective leader. As we've done in other modules in this specialization, you've completed a self-assessment on your conflict management style. I'd like now to share with you the results of my own. What you see in this plot of the various styles is that I have an overall, what I would call, supportive approach to conflict resolution. The three styles that dominate all result in at least partial wins for the other party in that conflict resolution. My dominant style tends to be a collaborative one, and I think this is a reflection of my many years in a research and development environment where I use reason as my approach to communicating and resolving issues, creative problem solving. So that collaborative approach tends to be very high for my personal assessment. I also have a fairly high score on accommodating one, and what that says to me is that I pick my battles carefully. There are some battles that I just choose not to fight, and I'll readily cede to the other party in that conflict. As you look at your self-assessment, figure out which styles you tend to use as your default style and where you might want to devote some attention to developing skill in those other areas that will be useful in the conflicts that you have to resolve as a leader. Welcome to the journaling segment from Module 3 in our Relationship Management course. Again, we're coming to you from the Brockman patio. Today, I'd like to share with you an example of a situation where when I applied all of the coaching and counseling techniques that we've described in this module, I still was not successful. I do this because you need to be prepared for those times when all of these techniques don't work. Then what do you do? In my particular example, I had an employee who was an underperformer. Over time, I used the coaching techniques regularly and in a progressively more severe manner in order to get improved performance. Ultimately, that was unsuccessful and I had to shift into a counseling mode. When I did that, the employee realized that his situation was extremely severe and it raised his emotional level to the point where we actually experienced raised voices and almost a physical conflict. I had to resort to asking him to leave my office. That's a situation I'm not particularly proud of, but it illustrates that when not skillfully done, these techniques are not very effective. Ultimately, I had to draw in help from outside my department. I had to get help from the human resources folks and other managers who had similar kinds of experiences to help guide me through to resolve the issue. In the end, we did. However, this employee was never fully happy with his situation and in the end decided to leave the company. I use this example to illustrate that you won't always be successful. That should not discourage you from continuing to try to use the techniques that are here and master them so that you can apply them in an artful and skillful way and achieve positive results. Welcome to the end of our third module in the Relationship Management course. It's now time to revisit my leadership observation. You should recall that I said that because leadership involves people, it's inherently messy. Well, leaders are expected to clean up their own messes when they create them. I believe that part of having an internal locus of control as a leader, that a leader should take accountability and responsibility for cleaning up the messes that they create. Let's take a look now at what we covered in this module. We looked at the sources and effects of conflict, particularly those that are either issue or people-centered. We looked at management styles. Here we looked at the avoiding, forcing, accommodating, compromising, and collaborative styles. We then followed that with looking at how we could apply the collaborative style to solving conflict issues. We looked at that from the perspective of three people: the initiator, the responder, and ultimately the mediator, who might help to force the process stay on track. I then presented a tool that you can use in conflict management situations called the ladder of inference, where you recognize that conflict exists and you need to take steps to reduce the emotional content of that conflict and arrive at a mutually acceptable solution. As you grow as a leader, your ability to manage conflict will distinguish you from other leaders, either favorably or unfavorably. The choice is yours to determine which of those it will be. Welcome to Module 4 in our Relationship Management Specialization. In this lesson, we'll cover a topic about which I have some very strong feelings: conducting effective meetings. For good or bad over the years, my perception of the abilities and skills of leaders is formed in how well they conduct meetings. The reason for that is meetings are resource intensive. They require the time of the participants, and in order to be respectful of that time, the leader must be efficient in the way they conduct meetings. So let's begin, as we do with all modules, with my leadership observation. Good leaders have a sense of humor, even if it's only to laugh at themselves. Again, we'll come back to that observation at the end of the module. Let's take a look at the objectives for this module. We'll define what I consider to be the two types of meetings. We'll look at the four purposes for meetings. We'll look at the principles of planning a meeting effectively so that you're not wasteful of the participants' time. And then we'll review some techniques that you can use every day in conducting meetings that will help you be more effective. No meeting is over once the participants leave the room. In order to ensure closure on all of the actions that were generated during the course of the meeting, the facilitator or leader must ensure that there is follow-up that occurs once the meeting is over. Lastly, I will present a tool that you can use in the planning process for meetings that will hopefully help you be more effective as you plan your meetings. If you want to establish a positive reputation as a leader, you can start by conducting effective meetings. I'm going to draw now on my military experience as we describe the types of meetings that you might conduct. So let's begin with the first type of meeting that I am going to call a hasty meeting. This is the kind of meeting that you might call in a crisis situation. An emergency where you need to huddle quickly with key people on your staff or other key leaders in order to address a particular issue that requires immediate attention. Even these kinds of meetings require some planning. You just don't walk into these meetings without having that idea in mind. I call the planning that's necessary for a hasty meeting as addressing the 5 W's: who, what, where, when, and why. You need to decide who needs to be present, who are the key leaders in this crisis that need to be there to share the information or make decisions that you'll make in these kinds of meetings. What is the topic? Make sure that the topic is focused. If you diverge into non-important topics, you can reduce substantially the effectiveness of this meeting. You need to decide where it's going to be. Where do you conduct this meeting so that you can influence the action following the meeting the best way that you can? When is the meeting going to be held? When is it appropriate? How soon can you get the key players together to participate in this meeting? And then, of course, why are you conducting this meeting? Answering that question will help you provide the focus that you need to be extremely efficient in this particular kind of meeting. Our other kinds of meetings would be what I call deliberate meetings. These are all of the other kinds of meetings that you might conduct that don't fall into that category of the hasty meeting. All of these meetings require significant planning and preparation. In addition to the 5 W's, there are a variety of other topics that need to be considered in order to make these kinds of meetings most effective. And we'll devote some considerable attention to that in the next lesson. If you fail to devote the attention that it takes to conduct good meetings, then your meetings will result in confusion and frustration on the part of its participants. In the field of literature around conducting effective meetings, I think you'll find that there's a great deal of written that would give the impression that you can apply certain gimmicks to make your meetings more effective. Nothing could be further from the truth. Every meeting you conduct will require thorough preparation, and it begins with establishing the purpose for your meetings. In my experience as an engineer, I found that there are 4 key types of meetings, and I'll discuss each of those in a little detail now. The simplest of these is the information sharing meeting. The leader will conduct these when there is administrative information that needs to be shared with members of the staff or his followers. These require probably the least amount of preparation, yet are extremely important that they aren't overdone on the part of the leader. Next is the decision-making meeting. This particular kind of meeting requires significant upfront preparation by the leader in order to ensure that all of the participants arrive at the meeting fully prepared to participate in discussions and to help make the decision that is the desired outcome for the meeting. We'll spend more time talking about the preparation for making decisions in a later lesson. The leader may call a meeting in order to brainstorm ideas, particularly in those situations where the group is participating in a creative problem-solving exercise. The leader may desire to generate as many options as he possibly can and use the brainstorming format to do so. Lastly, as an engineer, you may find yourself participating in workshops, where these are situations where you're actually performing engineering kinds of work with the assistance of others in the team. You conduct these when the only way to get the work done is to bring people together in order to produce a work product. My experience is that meetings are much more effective if you don't mix purposes. Stay focused, stay efficient, stay productive. As we think about the conduct of meetings, I like to divide their conduct into 3 distinct phases. First, those things that occur before the meeting ever actually happens. Second, the actual meeting itself and the facilitation that goes on within the meeting. And lastly, those things that have to be done after the meeting in order to ensure the success of the meeting. So let's begin by looking at those actions that you would take before the meeting actually occurs. As we described previously, we talked about establishing the purpose for the meeting. Being clear on the purpose will be vital to ensure efficiency during the conduct of the meeting. Make sure that you pay strict attention to how you structure the meeting around that purpose. Next, determine who the right people are. This is the who of the 5 W's. Make sure that the right people in the audience are there that either need to receive information or participate in the decision or do the brainstorming and workshop items that we talked about in the purposes. Set the agenda. As you set the agenda, make sure that it addresses specifically the topics that you need to cover, but as well covers a flow of information throughout the course of the meeting that is both logical and follows a pattern that you can use in subsequent meetings. Ahead of time, you may need to send out some pre-reading materials. This will be extremely important as you approach decision-making meetings, brainstorming meetings, and perhaps some workshops. The participants in the meeting need to be prepared ahead of time in order to be effective participants during the meeting itself. Failure to get these pre-reading materials out will ensure that you spend too much time in the meeting grounding everybody in the details of the topics to be discussed. Make sure that the preparations for the location of the meeting that you're going to conduct are appropriate, that the meeting facilities have the audio-visual, the presentation materials, flip charts, tables, whatever you need to support the meeting is actually there. Prior planning of that will ensure that you don't come up short during the actual meeting itself. As part of that, make sure that you address the ergonomics. Make sure that the seating is appropriate, that the air conditioning or heating is appropriate so that your participants are not uncomfortable. Before you actually send out the agenda and prepare to conduct the meeting, go back and reassess. Do we really need to conduct this face-to-face meeting? Are there alternatives that I might be able to use instead of bringing people together and consuming their time away from their normal work responsibilities? Can I use email? Could I do a video conference instead so that you avoid people having to travel to be at meetings? Lastly, as part of your preparation, send out the meeting notice well ahead of time. To the extent you can do this in weeks ahead of time would be even better. Last-minute notifications of meetings always result in confusion and some frustration as people have to adjust their schedules in order to attend your meeting. Lack of pre-meeting preparation will almost always ensure that the outcome will be unsatisfactory. In spite of our best efforts in planning an effective meeting, they can still fail if it's not facilitated well. So let's spend some time now to talk about those things that you can do to ensure that the meeting is conducted in an effective manner. We start with starting and ending on time. I consider this to be one of the most important things you can do to be respectful of the time of the participants in the meeting. Starting late and ending late disrupts the schedules of those who are participating in the meeting, particularly in an age where there are other demands and there may be other meetings that the participants may need to attend. So devote particular attention to starting and ending on time. At the beginning of the meeting, do a review of the agenda so that everybody's minds are refreshed on what the content of that meeting is. One of the things that I like to do as part of this agenda setting was also to do a check-in. And that was a process whereby we invited the participants in the meeting to share whether or not there were distractions that might prevent them from participating fully in the meeting. Part of this agenda review would be refreshing everyone's memory on what happened during the last meeting and any carryover actions or results that need to be reviewed before we proceed to the agenda of the current meeting. I like to use what's called a parking lot. This is a well-known tool that can be used to capture items that come up in the course of a discussion during a meeting that are not directly related to the content outlined in the agenda. Using the parking lot can allow you to record those items that can be addressed in either a later agenda, a later meeting, or outside of the meeting itself. I like to assign certain roles in meetings so that the functions are addressed to help us keep on track and focused on the agenda. First among these would be the facilitator for the meeting. The facilitator's job is to make sure that not only is the agenda followed, but when we veer off track, to redirect the conversation. I also like to see a timekeeper used, somebody who can keep us aware of the time we've spent on various items and ensure that we progress efficiently through the meeting, and to let us know when we are at risk of overstepping the boundaries of the time limits we've imposed by the agenda. I like to have a recorder. Trying to facilitate a meeting and record the results is a difficult process and could result in some conflicts in the roles that would lead to inefficiency in conducting the meeting. Having a recorder who can record action items and key decisions that are made will help the facilitator conduct the meeting appropriately. Lastly, I like to designate somebody in the group who has permission to be the devil's advocate, somebody who can challenge ideas and make sure that we don't get into groupthink and, as a result, make poor decisions. Make sure that all of the action items are recorded. As the action itself is recorded, make sure that there is a person designated as accountable for that particular action. That will be reviewed at the end of the meeting to make sure that we've accurately recorded all of the steps that need to be taken once this meeting is over. At the end of the meeting, there should be a summary of those action items to make sure that everybody knows that the action item has been recorded and who is responsible for conducting it. As part of the summary, I also like to do a check on how did we do in this meeting, a mini after-action review, those things that we want to start doing that we aren't doing in the meetings, those things that we would like to stop doing that are resulting in inefficiencies, and those things that we're doing well that we want to continue to do in future meetings. Lastly, we want to make sure that we have a follow-up process in place so that we know where we're going once we leave the meeting. Once the participants leave the meeting's not over. There are a great many actions that need to be taken post-meeting in order to ensure that your meeting was indeed effective. As the expression goes, the meeting is not over until the paperwork is complete. There are a variety of actions that you'll want to complete before you close out a particular meeting. Let's review some of those now. First, you'll want to issue a summary to both the participants and the stakeholders. This is particularly important to allow the participants the opportunity to make corrections or additions based on their perceptions of what occurred during the meeting. For the stakeholders, this is an opportunity to ensure that they remain informed and that you can rely on their continued support for the actions of the team. In that summary, you ought to make sure that you capture action items, decisions, any parking lot items that might have come up during the course of the meeting, and any ideas that came up in your review of how the meeting went, things that you might want to stop, start, or continue to ensure the success of future meetings. You want to capture all the action items in a format that makes it easy for you to track, whether this is a spreadsheet, a Word document, to-do list. Doesn't make too much difference as long as you have the ability to know where you are on the progress of those action items between meetings. With the end of one meeting begins the process of planning the next. Make sure that you go back to that deliberate planning process that we outlined earlier so that you can set up the flow of information and actions to make the next meeting, in fact, a success. As you can see, conducting a meeting is hard work and requires focused attention on your part. Relying on gimmicks will not bring the effectiveness that you need. Now we come to the leadership tools segment for this module. Have you ever been in a meeting that got off track, got in the ditch, and you experienced frustration that things weren't going as they were supposed to and that your time was being wasted? Well, in this section, I'd like to introduce a tool that I and other managers at Shell used to ensure that we could redirect meetings to get back on track when we felt we were in the ditch. We call this the process check. It has its origins in the quality process that Shell and many other organizations went through in the 1980s and 90s, where we mapped out our work processes in great detail. Part of that process was a review of how things actually went after you executed the process. These became known as process checks. Over time, the term evolved to the point where it could be used at any time during a meeting to check to see whether the group was performing as it was supposed to be performing, whether the work processes in place were in fact being followed. Later on, we empowered all members of a team to institute the process check when they felt that the group wasn't performing as it was supposed to, or, as we commonly refer to it, in the ditch. If you desire to use the process check, it's most effective when all members of the team are empowered to use it. As such, it ought to become part of your group norms. Most effectively, it's used when incorporated into the charter of the team when it is initially set up. That way, it becomes routine and commonly accepted among all members of the team. So, whether it's part of your charter or you add this in later on, make sure that all participants are aware that they can use it whenever necessary. The tool itself is simply a code word. We chose in Shell to use process check because it evolved out of the quality movement. However, you can use whatever term you choose that works for your particular team. Whether it's a code word or phrase, the idea is that members of the team can use it at times when you're not performing effectively as a team in a meeting. The process check is a tool that any member of the team can use when they realize that the group is no longer functioning effectively, that they're distracted or have lost focus and gotten away from the agenda. The way this is used is that the team member who recognizes this issue can use the code word or phrase that shows that there's a problem. At this point, other members of the team should respectfully acknowledge that that issue has been raised and then begin to address how they're going to get back in process and back to the focused work that needs to be done by the team. Any issues that do come up as a result of this could well be items that would go on the parking lot for the meeting. So rather than neglect them entirely, make sure that those ideas are captured so that they can be addressed effectively at a later time. I hope that you might be able to use the process check as a new tool in your toolkit to help you run effective meetings. But it's helpful to understand that in the course of conducting meetings, every participant in the meeting has some accountability to ensure its success. Welcome to the journaling segment for week 4 of our relationship management course. Today, I have an example of what happens when meetings are not conducted effectively. During my career as a manager at Shell, the site manager initiated a program where there would be a monthly meeting of all of the managers on the site to have a discussion forum to address issues of concern to any of the particular managers. Initially, this program was highly successful. We had very active participation from the managers and very energetic discussions of topics of interest. However, over time, this meeting devolved into one where the site manager would have non-technical functions come in and do what I called a data dump of information on the site managers, because this was an occasion where they were all together and they could be efficient doing that. As a result, the meeting shifted from being one that was of interest to the managers to one that was strictly an information sharing session where that information could have been provided without having to bring us all together and consume our time. Not only that, but this meeting also had a habit of starting late and ending late. So it was not very respectful of the time of the people involved. As you can imagine, the interest in this particular meeting diminished dramatically over time, and ultimately, the managers started voting with their feet and stopped showing up. So I encourage you, as you go about designing and conducting effective meetings, make sure that you keep it relevant and that the topics that you cover are of interest to those in the meeting. Congratulations, we've now reached the end of our 4th module in the relationship management course. Let's take a moment to return to my leadership observation for this module. Leaders should have a sense of humor, even if it's only to laugh at themselves. The flip side of this is that a leader who can't laugh at himself has no business laughing at others. Now let's look at what we covered in this module. We talked about the types of meetings. I described these as hasty and deliberate meetings, both of which require some level of planning, even in the case of the hasty meetings where they're called on short notice. We talked about the purposes of meetings, whether it's to share information, to make decisions, to brainstorm, or to actually do work in a workshop format. We talked about the need for deliberate planning, deliberate and thorough planning in the pre-meeting phase, the actual conduct of the meeting, and even after the meeting is over to ensure closure. Lastly, I presented a tool that you can use to help get out of the ditch when your team varies from the agenda and is no longer being productive. I called this the process check. If you want to build a stronger, healthier team, strengthen those relationships in positive ways, you can begin by conducting effective meetings.